So guys, the neighborhood we just passed through was the Latin Quarter. We're actually in the Latin Quarter now as well. You're probably wondering why it's called the Latin Quarter. I know when I first came here, I thought it had to do with Latin America, but you surely see that there's no salsa clubs, no mariachi singing in the street, no taco vendors. That's because it has nothing to do whatsoever with Latin America. It actually goes back a little bit further than America. It goes back to the mid-13th century when they opened the Sorbonne. Actually before that to the University of Paris. But this neighborhood is a home to a lot of universities. So back in the day, people would come here to study. They didn't come and study the things that we study today. They came to study God. They came to be monks or priests or theologians. So they would come from all over Europe, and they spoke a myriad of different languages, but they had one in common, and that was Latin. So if you were to walk through these streets back then, you would hear mostly Latin being spoken, not French. It was because it was the language that they used to communicate with each other. Also the language that school was taught in. So also the language of the church. So big Latin area here. Student life was a little bit different than it is today back then. I know today when you think of student life, I think of my college career. I think of cake parties. I think of apartment complexes full of college kids getting drunk all the time and having a good time on their parents' dollar. Back then it was a little bit different. The students often had wounds on their back from getting beaten by the professors. They lived in poor houses where they paid way too much to live there. They ate vegetable stew most of the nights. Sometimes they would have sheep or mutton on feast days. They also studied by candlelight all night long, because that was the only time they had to study. And then they would wake up at 5 a.m. to the cold. They usually had something like 1 or 2 garments to cover up with that were patched. And their lodgers took advantage of them by charging too much, and so did their tutors, because the only way to make money if you were a teacher was to charge your students too much money. So it was, don't pay attention to any of them. They're obviously drunk. So yes, student life was a lot different back then. Actually the Sorbonne goes back a little bit farther than 1257. It goes back to the middle of the 12th century when they opened up the University of Paris. So the University of Paris was the first university in the city, and it was associated with Notre Dame. The person who founded the University of Paris was a man named Pierre Abelard. And Abelard has a very, very interesting story. He's very, very famous in French history. So Abelard was this tutor. Like many of the men back then, he would go from town to town learning, teaching, trying to make your way, trying to learn. It wasn't until his late 30s that he ended up here in Paris. He ended up here. He was looking for a place to stay. He had a good name, so a man named Canon Fulbert invited him into his house to stay. Canon Fulbert in exchange wanted Abelard to tutor his daughter. She was a considerable young woman of learning, and she was also very, very attractive. Abelard and Heloise was her name. They started a romance, very indiscreet romance. Everybody knew what was going on. He was 20 years older than she was, and he got her pregnant. And so that was really bad for them, especially back then, because he was trying to be a theologian, so it was really bad for his career. So she didn't want to marry him. She wanted to kind of hide everything. I'm just looking at those people getting their mattresses out of a hole. Anyway, she didn't. So anyway, back to what I was saying. She didn't want to get married. He wanted to get married to prove to her that he loved her and also to save her name. So they got married in secret to please the Canon Fulbert, her uncle. And so they got married. It wasn't enough for Canon Fulbert because late one night he paid some men to break into Abelard's room and castrate him. So then Abelard was castrated. So what had happened is he became a monk, Heloise became a nun, and a little bit later in the story he comes back to Paris and now that he doesn't have any testicles, he's very, very focused on being a teacher, and he becomes an incredible professor. He brings Aristotle, Plato back into the curriculum. He teaches his students to question him, which is at the chagrin of his colleagues. His motto was, doubt leads to inquiry, inquiry leads to truth. So people back then really didn't like what he was teaching because they liked to be the authority figures. So that's Abelard Heloise. He opens the University of Paris in the middle of the 12th century. So speeding back up into the 20th century, this is also the home to a lot of artists. It's home to the first Shakespearean Company. You might have seen Shakespearean Company over there by the Seine. The first Shakespeare Company was ran by Sylvia Beach, and it was a place where a lot of lost generation writers would meet, and Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, James Joyce. In fact, the first Shakespeare Company published Ulysses for the first time. So very, very big in history. The reason that the first Shakespeare Company shut down is because a Nazi came in to buy a book, and Sylvia Beach refused to sell the Nazi a book, and so the Nazis came and shut down the entire store. The Shakespeare Company that's open today, it's named in honor of the first Shakespeare Company. So also in this neighborhood you have Gertrude Stein's apartment at 37 Rue de Fleury. It's also another place where a lot of the writers would meet and have literary conversations. And anyway, all this stuff, Gertrude Stein would kind of guide them through their art. So today, it's actually still home to many colleges, including the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne is a huge university here in Paris. Everybody's probably heard of it. And it's also kind of gotten a little bit gentrified. The eastern half is pretty chic now. But it still is the student quarter, so you still can't find a good cheap beer and a good place to eat. If you guys have any, if you guys are wondering or staying in the area, just let me know and I'll guide you into a place at the end of the tour. So now let's head over to the Ile de City and let's do some. So let's talk about some more ancient history.